American radar stations along the Alaskan coast flickered with phantom signals on the morning of June 7, 1968, as Soviet reconnaissance aircraft probed deeper into North American airspace than any previous incursion had dared. The pilots were testing response times, mapping radar gaps, and photographing coastal installations under direct orders from Moscow's General Staff, which had spent the previous 18 months quietly wargaming a scenario that would have triggered the most geographically bizarre front of World War III. What chain of strategic miscalculations and ideological pressures brought the Kremlin to the brink of authorizing an amphibious assault on American soil? And why did Alaska become the focal point of Soviet military fantasy during the late 1960s? To understand how close this came to reality, you need to grasp the peculiar vulnerability Alaska represented in Soviet strategic thinking. The state had been American for barely a century, purchased from the Russian Empire in 1867 for $7.2 million in a transaction many Russians still regarded as a humiliating mistake. Soviet planners in the 1960s worked from maps that still labeled the region using old Imperial Russian nomenclature, and the psychological wound of that sale never fully healed in Moscow's corridors of power. More importantly, Alaska jutted into the Soviet sphere of influence, like a dagger pointed at the heart of the USSR's Pacific coast. The Bering Strait, at its narrowest point just 55 miles wide, represented both a historical connection and a strategic nightmare. Marshal Andrei Gretko, who became Soviet Minister of Defense in 1967, had served as commander of Soviet forces in Germany and understood territorial buffers. When he turned his attention to the Pacific theater, he saw Alaska as NATO's aircraft carrier permanently anchored off Siberia's coast. The genesis of actual invasion planning began not with military ambition, but with resource anxiety. If you're watching this because you want to understand how Soviet decision-making really worked, beyond the propaganda and the stereotypes, subscribe now and join viewers who dig into the institutional mechanics that drove Cold War crises. By 1966, Soviet geologists had confirmed that the USSR's Western Siberian oil fields, while vast, would require decades of infrastructure investment in one of Earth's most hostile environments. American petroleum engineers, meanwhile, had just discovered the Prudhoe Bay oil field on Alaska's North Slope, a reserve that would eventually yield over 12 billion barrels. The timing was devastating for Moscow's strategic calculus. The Soviet economy was growing, but inefficiently. The space program demanded resources. The military demanded parity with NATO. The satellite states in Eastern Europe demanded subsidized energy to maintain political stability. And here was America, the ideological enemy, sitting on an oil reserve larger than anything the Soviets could bring online in the next decade, positioned on territory that had been Russian within living memory. Marshal Gretko commissioned a feasibility study in early 1967, assigning the task to the Frunze Military Academy's Strategic Planning Directorate. The resulting document, portions of which were declassified by Russian archives in 2004, laid out a scenario designated Operation Anadyr II, named in deliberate echo of the deception operation that deployed Soviet missiles to Cuba. The plan assumed a limited conventional war aimed at seizing Alaska's northern coast and establishing a defensive perimeter roughly along the Brooks Range. The operational goals were explicit: deny the United States access to Prudhoe Bay, establish Soviet sovereignty over the Bering Strait, and create a bargaining chip for broader negotiations over European force deployments. The timeline projected a 48-hour window between initial landings and the arrival of American reinforcements from the continental United States. Everything depended on speed, surprise, and the calculation that Washington would choose negotiation over nuclear escalation for a sparsely populated territory. But military planning exists in a context of political will, and here the story becomes a study in institutional momentum overcoming common sense. Leonid Brezhnev had consolidated power by 1967, but his authority rested on balancing factions within the Politburo, the Central Committee, and the military establishment. He was not Stalin. He could not simply dictate policy. He needed consensus, or at least the appearance of it. And in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there existed a faction within Soviet leadership that believed Nikita Khrushchev's fundamental error had been backing down, not the initial deployment. These hardliners, concentrated in the military and the defense-industrial complex, argued that American restraint in 1962 proved Washington would accept territorial losses rather than risk nuclear war. Gretko was not the most extreme voice in this faction, but his position as defense minister gave him the bureaucratic authority to translate ideology into operational planning. The Frunze study identified the invasion force requirements with chilling precision. 3 motor rifle divisions, approximately 45,000 troops, would constitute the initial landing force. They would embark from Petropavlovsk, Kamchatsky, and Magadan, crossing the Bering Sea under cover of darkness in a fleet of landing ships and converted merchant vessels. Air superiority would be contested by elements of the Soviet Pacific Fleet's naval aviation, staging from bases in Chukotka and the Kamchatka Peninsula. The plan acknowledged that American air power would eventually dominate the battlefield, which meant Soviet forces had to achieve their territorial objectives before the United States could bring its full military weight to bear. The document estimated acceptable casualties at 30 to 40% of the landing force, a number that reflected Soviet military culture's historical willingness to absorb catastrophic losses in pursuit of strategic objectives. What makes this more than a theoretical exercise is the physical preparation that actually occurred. Throughout 1968 and into early 1969, the Soviet Pacific Fleet conducted unusually large-scale amphibious exercises in the Sea of Okhotsk and along the Kamchatka coast. Western intelligence noted these maneuvers, but interpreted them within the context of general Soviet military expansion rather than specific targeting. The terrain where these exercises took place closely matched Alaska's coastal geography, permafrost, tundra, limited road infrastructure, and extreme weather conditions. Specialized Arctic equipment began flowing to Far Eastern military districts in quantities that exceeded normal rotation schedules. The 64th Motor Rifle Division, based near Khabarovsk, received priority allocation of BTR-60 armored personnel carriers modified with enhanced cold weather packages. In December 1968, the Soviet Merchant Marine transferred 12 ice-strengthened cargo vessels to Pacific Fleet Auxiliary Command, ships capable of navigating the Bering Strait during marginal ice conditions. The human element of this planning reveals how institutions can drive toward catastrophe through cumulative small decisions. Lieutenant General Dmitry Akramayev, who later became Marshal and Chief of the General Staff under Gorbachev, was in 1968 a rising colonel assigned to operations planning. In his memoirs, published in the early 1990s before his suicide, he described the atmosphere within the General Staff as one of professional detachment from political reality. Officers competed for career advancement by producing ever more detailed, impressive operational plans. The institutional incentive structure rewarded thoroughness and boldness, not caution or strategic restraint. No single officer wanted to be the one telling the defense minister that his favored project was infeasible. The result was a planning process that took on its own momentum, each layer of detail making the operation seem more real, more achievable, and therefore more likely to receive final authorization. Yet even as military planning accelerated, political and logistical realities began undermining the scenario's feasibility. The Soviet economy in the late 1960s was approaching what would later be recognized as structural stagnation. Maintaining military parity with NATO in Europe consumed roughly 15 to 17% of Soviet GDP, a burden that left little margin for additional major operations. The war in Vietnam, where the USSR provided extensive military aid to North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, was draining resources at an accelerating rate. Soviet military advisors in Southeast Asia were reporting that American combat performance, despite political constraints, demonstrated technological and logistical capabilities that far exceeded what Frunze's planners had assumed. The lesson from Vietnam should have been that American forces, once fully committed and politically unleashed, could generate combat power at a scale the Soviet military could not match in a peripheral theater like Alaska. Intelligence analysis added another layer of doubt. The GRU, Soviet military intelligence, maintained networks throughout the United States that provided reasonably accurate assessments of American military readiness and public sentiment. Reports from these sources consistently indicated that an attack on American territory, even sparsely populated Alaska, would produce a political response in Washington that would make Vietnam-era restraints impossible. The American public might tolerate ambiguous conflicts in distant regions, but a direct territorial assault would unify national opinion in ways that would give any president unlimited political capital for military response. The GRU's American analysts predicted that Washington would respond with strategic bombing of Soviet Far Eastern bases, possible naval blockades, and at minimum a general military mobilization that would shift the global balance of power against Moscow. The technological dimension further complicated Soviet calculations. Alaska in the late 1960s was not the isolated frontier of previous decades. The construction of the distant early warning line, a chain of radar stations across Arctic Canada and Alaska, completed in the late 1950s, meant that any significant air or naval movement across the Bering Sea would be detected hours before reaching Alaskan shores. American F-4 Phantom fighters, based at Elmendorf Air Force Base near Anchorage, could reach the Bering Strait in under an hour. The United States maintained approximately 5,000 military personnel in Alaska by 1968, not enough to repel an invasion but sufficient to delay and harass Soviet forces while reinforcements mobilized. More critically, American submarine-launched ballistic missiles deployed aboard Polaris submarines in the Pacific created a secure second strike capability that made any Soviet calculation of nuclear escalation deeply uncertain. The decisive factor that ultimately killed Operation Anadyr II was not military or economic but geopolitical. In March 1969, Soviet and Chinese forces clashed along the Ussuri River border in what became known as the Zhenbao Island Incident. The fighting, which involved armor and artillery and killed dozens on both sides, shattered any remaining illusion of socialist bloc unity and forced Moscow to confront the possibility of a two-front conflict. The 7,000-kilometer border between the USSR and China suddenly became a strategic vulnerability that demanded massive military resources. Within months of the Ussuri clashes, the Soviet Union began the largest peacetime military buildup along its southern frontier in its history, eventually deploying over 40 divisions to face Chinese forces. Every division sent to the Chinese border was a division unavailable for adventures in the Pacific. The institutional momentum behind Alaskan invasion planning collapsed almost overnight as strategic priorities shifted. But the near miss left traces that shaped subsequent Soviet and American policy. The United States, through signals intelligence and satellite reconnaissance, detected enough of the Soviet preparation to trigger a classified National Security Council study on Alaskan vulnerabilities. This study, completed in late 1969, resulted in significant infrastructure investments in Alaska throughout the 1970s. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline, completed in 1977, included security features designed to survive sabotage and military attack. American military presence in Alaska expanded significantly, with Elmendorf Air Force Base receiving upgraded facilities and additional fighter squadrons. The Army established Fort Greely as a cold-weather training center, ensuring that American forces maintained Arctic warfare capabilities that could match Soviet expertise. From Moscow's perspective, the episode reinforced a strategic lesson that would define late Cold War Soviet policy. The USSR could challenge American interests in the Third World through proxies and limited commitments, but direct military confrontation on American soil would trigger a response the Soviet Union could not sustain. This recognition shaped Soviet behavior in subsequent crises. When Solidarity challenged communist rule in Poland in the early 1980s, Moscow pressured the Polish government to impose martial law rather than invade directly, partly because the Afghan war had already demonstrated the costs of Soviet military overreach. The institutional memory of how close the Alaskan Plan came to approval and how catastrophic its consequences would likely have been created a constituency for restraint within the General Staff that tempered some of the more aggressive impulses of Soviet hardliners. The maps used in the Frunze study, with their careful markings of landing beaches and supply routes, remained filed in Moscow military archives for decades. When Russian historians gained access to these materials after the Soviet collapse, they found operational plans worked out to astonishing levels of detail, which specific ships would carry which battalions, where field hospitals would be established, even contingency plans for governing occupied territory. The depth of this planning reflected both the professionalism of Soviet military staff work and the dangerous disconnect between operational feasibility and strategic wisdom. An institution capable of planning an amphibious invasion with such thoroughness was also capable of convincing itself that the plan could work, despite overwhelming evidence that it would trigger a catastrophic escalation. The personnel who developed Operation Anadyr II pursued varied careers that illuminate different aspects of Soviet institutional culture. Some, like Akramayev, rose to the highest levels of military command and later grappled with the moral weight of the system they had served. Others quietly retired, their role in planning an unrealized war remaining classified until archival releases decades later. A few became vocal critics of Soviet military policy during the Glasnost period, using their insider knowledge to argue that the USSR's militarization had been both economically unsustainable and strategically counterproductive. But at the time, in the closed world of the General Staff, they were professional officers executing orders, applying technical expertise to a problem defined by their superiors, participants in a bureaucratic process that could have started a war. For the United States, The intelligence indicators of potential Soviet action in Alaska contributed to a broader reassessment of American vulnerability. The strategic assumption that geography and nuclear deterrence made American territory inviolable came under quiet reconsideration. Defense intellectuals began exploring scenarios that combined conventional military action with political warfare and crisis management in ways that might stay below the nuclear threshold. This thinking influenced the development of flexible response doctrines and the expansion of American conventional forces throughout the 1970s. The Alaska scenario, while never publicly acknowledged as a specific Soviet plan, entered into the catalog of contingencies that American war planners had to address. The environmental and economic dimensions of the Alaskan invasion scenario also merit attention because they reveal how resource competition drove Cold War tensions in ways often overshadowed by ideological narratives. The Soviet Union's chronic inability to efficiently exploit its own vast natural resources created a permanent sense of economic insecurity that military solutions seemed to address. If Soviet economic planners had possessed the technology and infrastructure to develop Siberian oil fields at the pace American companies developed Alaska's reserves, the entire strategic calculus would have been different. The invasion planning was ultimately an admission of Soviet economic weakness disguised as military contingency. It reflected the reality that in resource development, in infrastructure construction, in the application of complex technology to hostile environments, the Soviet system consistently underperformed its capitalist rival. The psychological dimension of the Alaska scenario touches on something deeper about national identity and historical grievance. The Russian Empire's sale of Alaska remained a wound in Russian national consciousness precisely because it symbolized a moment of weakness and miscalculation. In 1867, Russian officials believed Alaska was economically worthless and strategically indefensible, so they sold it to prevent British seizure during a future conflict. The subsequent discovery of gold, and eventually oil, transformed that 19th-century decision into a historical mistake that Soviet propagandists occasionally referenced when discussing capitalist exploitation of resources. The military planners working on Operation Anadyr II were not explicitly motivated by reversing the Alaska Purchase, but the psychological satisfaction of reclaiming lost territory certainly added emotional weight to what was ostensibly a rational strategic calculation. Comparing the Alaska Plan to other Soviet military operations reveals patterns in how Moscow approached risk and escalation. The decision to deploy missiles to Cuba in 1962 and the decision to invade Afghanistan in 1979 both reflected a similar institutional dynamic, confident military planning disconnected from realistic assessment of adversary response. In Cuba, Khrushchev believed Kennedy would accept the missiles rather than risk war. In Afghanistan, the Politburo believed a quick military intervention would stabilize a client regime without triggering sustained American opposition. The Alaska scenario fit this pattern: sophisticated operational planning coupled with wishful thinking about enemy behavior. The institutional structure of Soviet decision-making, which concentrated technical military expertise in the general staff while isolating it from broader political and intelligence analysis, repeatedly produced this dangerous combination. The aftermath of the plan's cancellation also shaped Soviet naval development in ways that extended beyond the immediate crisis. The Pacific Fleet received sustained investment throughout the 1970s, growing from a secondary force to a major component of Soviet naval power. While this buildup served multiple strategic purposes, including countering American carrier groups and maintaining pressure on China, it also reflected the lingering influence of planners who had envisioned Pacific operations on a grand scale. The submarines, surface combatants, and naval aviation assets deployed to the Pacific Fleet created capabilities that, while never used for an Alaskan invasion, significantly complicated American strategic planning throughout the remainder of the Cold War. What ultimately makes the Alaska invasion scenario historically significant is not what happened, but what it reveals about institutional dynamics under pressure. The Soviet Union in the late 1960s was a superpower with global reach, but fundamental weaknesses it could not acknowledge. Economic inefficiency, technological lag in civilian sectors, and the mounting costs of empire created pressures that military solutions seemed to address. An institution that cannot solve problems through economic performance or political legitimacy turns to coercion and force. The detailed planning for an Alaskan invasion was a symptom of this deeper structural crisis, a military solution to problems that were fundamentally economic and political. For Alaska itself, the legacy of this near miss is embedded in infrastructure and policy choices that persist to the present. The state's unusual level of militarization, its strategic importance in American defense planning, and the security measures built into its resource extraction infrastructure all trace back to the late Cold War period, when planners in both Moscow and Washington took seriously the possibility of conflict in the Arctic. The radar installations, the military bases, the emergency response protocols all exist because someone once sat in an office in Moscow sketching out landing zones and invasion routes on maps that still used Russian place names. The story of what did not happen can teach as much as the chronicle of what did. The Soviet plan to invade Alaska advanced far enough to generate detailed operational documents, to trigger military exercises, to redirect resources and attention within the defense establishment. Then it stopped killed by changing geopolitical circumstances and the belated recognition that tactical feasibility did not ensure strategic wisdom. In the gap between planning and execution, between institutional momentum and final authorization, catastrophe was averted. Studying that gap, understanding the pressures that nearly closed it and the factors that ultimately widened it, offers insight into how states stumble toward wars and how sometimes, through accident or wisdom, they step back from the edge. The maps of invasion routes that were never used, the landing craft that never departed, the battles that were never fought, these are as much a part of Cold War history as the conflicts that actually consumed lives and treasure. They represent the vast shadow archive of the wars that almost were, and they remind us that history is not only what happened, but also what was barely avoided.